Hello, and thank you for the opportunity to share with you today. My name is Kaun, and I'm going to be talking about the number one reason your OT inventory is failing. Just by way of introduction, my name is Kaun. I have been doing OT security program design, development, assessment, etc., for about 22 years now. I did work in a global role for Honeywell once upon a time, and from a vendor neutral perspective with a company called Matricon for many years before that. I'm now with Verve Security Center, or Verve Industrial rather, again, back to the vendor neutral perspective. But what I have been able to do over these 20 years is see the good, the bad, and the ugly in terms of how things usually roll out. And good news, bad news is 20 years later, we're making progress, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Hopefully today we're going to leverage some of those lessons learned over those 20 plus years and seeing the bad and the ugly and help you to try to maybe avoid some of that. By background introduction, Verve Industrial, if you haven't heard of us, is that we've been actually in the automation space for about 30 years. We started as systems integrators in 1993. And for the last 15, 16 years, we've been developing an endpoint approach to OT security, namely the Verve Security Center. I'm talking more about function and philosophy here today. We do draw a couple of parallels to what a suggested approach might be, but hopefully we're going to share some insights with you based on our over 30 years in automation and our 15 to 20 years in OT security specifically. So starting with the summary, the things I want to try and accomplish today. Inventory is a fundamental starting point to any program. I know that everybody knows they want to start with it. I know it's the beginning of every security standard. The first section of NIST is identify. The first section of NERC-CIP is, your hardware software inventory. First section of CIS is, do you have a hardware and a software inventory? Everybody understands it's a building block, but what many people don't quite capture is how often you use it throughout the process. It's not just a starting thing. You start once and throw it behind you and keep moving. And by the way, you do need to get it right. That's a single biggest issue that many people have if they don't know what they're doing with the inventory, not just today, but down the road. They make mistakes. And so the first sort of tipping point as to what may be a challenge is, what are you doing with this? And does your data collection effort match what your actual needs are? In the context of OT, there are additional challenges that sort of have led to that sort of subpoint there. Fragility leads to trepidation. There's a lot of concern about touching stuff in the OT space. And it does drive some behaviors that I think are short-sighted, and then also you sort of handicap your ability to be successful in this space. And then the result is what I'm calling the number one mistake. And that's not, rolling up our sleeves and doing it the right way the first time. Then I want to go to the second half of our topic, which is, okay, and so what do we do about it? What is the key to success? And that is context. And I'll build on that throughout the whole session here today. And then I want to drive a little bit of some use cases into some of the resulting efficiencies for you if you were to go ahead and try and take this approach. So without further ado, inventory basics. Many people think that inventory, or at least start with inventory, is primarily IP addresses and OS versions, right? We need to know how many we have, of what type, and what vintage, right? Well, that's a great start, but it is really just the nuanced, bare beginning building bones of what you need. What about the manufacturer? What if the manufacturer comes out and gets bought or sold, or changes the processor version, or has a new firmware update that doesn't come handily through a Windows update for you to map magically to vulnerabilities and updates in your OT environment? And if you're not behind somebody that offers a central management tool like a Rockwell Asset Center, how do you actually track those things, right? And so we need a manufacturer. What about hardware and software details for end of life, or for, again, firmware updates? We're going far beyond OS devices to networking and embedded gear, because those are the three classes of assets we need to worry about. What about what I call non-resident data? So there's stuff we can get from the endpoint, and there's stuff we can infer, and there's stuff we can actually cross-reference and verify. So when I'm looking at an IP address and I see that's a Rockwell device, well, is that a PLC that's controlling a critical function, or is that something that's controlling something that's interesting? We often talk at a power plant about how balance of plant and vibration monitoring. Well, vibration monitoring, something doesn't spin right and blows out of the casing, it can go through cinder block walls. That's a big risk. But that same vintage of PLC is also running the conveyor belt, bringing coal into the crusher. Well, if that conveyor belt goes down, we can just have the intern go jump in the front loader bucket tractor and dump it in the hopper manually. So there's a criticality and a function that's appended to these devices that changes our perspective. And so a one-dimensional or two-dimensional inventory, IP and address, IP address and OS sort of thing, very quickly leaves you wanting. And we need to have all sorts of information about these assets because, as I mentioned, it's not just your first pass of what do we have and how many of them do we have. It's what are we going to do about it? And this is a number of the most common practices that a typical OT security program would require. It is mapped roughly against the NIST CSF here, 5 categories, the 2 are collapsed here, but also around the policies and procedures you're going to develop. And typically people go over time through these different stages. As you notice, hardware and software inventory and maybe configuration or vulnerabilities are up here. But when you get to incident response or backup and restoration or patch management, your asset inventory is going to heavily influence how we actually build, for example, incident response or your backup rotation. Knowing what type of device you have, knowing its criticality, its location, its function, all of these feed into whether or not you're doing a daily full backup on a weekly offsite for your critical systems, or if you can do this monthly, or if it's redundant, you don't even care. So inventory is something that you need to make sure you understand all those contextual cues I gave you before up front so that you're not going back and reinventing the wheel in the future. So one of the big mistakes people have is that they're not understanding or not fully scoping what they need out of an inventory. It is a big mistake. It's not necessarily the number one mistake, but it is a very big mistake and an oversight that causes lots of rework in the future. This is, as I sort of intimated earlier, compounded in OT when you look at, I want all of that information about all of those things so I can do all of these tasks. And then we get to OT and it's full of legacy equipment. And this does 2 things. It makes it harder to get the data for many people, or at least seems to be more difficult. It's actually not. It also compounds the need for context. When we have, for example, the need to start collecting logs and we have a subset of assets that do not support syslog, how do I know that and manage that out in subsequent cycles, right? How do I know when I've got a patch that comes out to address a vulnerability, if it's supported by the vendor or not? If it's not, what are my compensating controls? How do I go through that? And I've got a slide that shows this complexity coming up and how that, again, further reinforces the need to be able to have contextual cues, not just raw data. Right. So OT has legacy equipment that we need to navigate. It has 3 classes of assets, which again makes this harder. Many people are afraid of touching PLCs and relays and controls with good cause. The reality is that there are safe ways of doing it. You do it every single day with your vendor software. So it's not out of the realm of possible, but most people shy away from that. And that's because of the last bullet there, that we often are dealing in fragile or high consequence environments. Everybody knows what an hour of downtime costs. Everybody knows what outsourcing accidents can happen in OT and cost tens of millions of dollars in unexpected downtime. So it is a fair concern, but it's something that shouldn't stop us dead in our tracks. There's often always also a large divide between IT and OT. IT obviously means well, everybody's in the same company, rowing the boat in the same direction, but they may not understand or may misstep. I mean, just subtle nuances of OT quirks and quarks around, auto reboot and auto log on, prevents the ability for log on banners. IT doesn't know that that's a thing in OT. And so it's not necessarily malicious, but it's not necessarily understood. And so, rightly so, based on history, quite often OT can be a little bit hesitant to let people in. The reality is that we do need to go and roll up our sleeves and do the hard work. So what are people doing based on this collection of challenges and obstacles and needs? Well, there's 3 of the most common paths. I'm going to walk through each of them. And this is where we're starting to get to the big mistakes. Manual. Many people build an inventory manually. We're going to walk around, we're going to collect the data, and then we're going to keep it up to date with process change management process, regular, refresh. Summer interns coming in from the engineering college, they need something to do. Well, here's a laptop and a spreadsheet and go see what we got out there and confirm it from last year when we did this. The challenge here is very error prone. It's very laborious to maintain, and it does not stay up to date no matter how good your process is. And it's very, very hard to export that data to other practices. Like I said, yeah, you've got an inventory list, but if it's a static list in a spreadsheet somewhere else, not live to the systems, how do we make those other informed decisions we were talking about a moment ago? The other thing that other people are doing is saying, well, maybe the manual doesn't work, so let's go to these other data sources that we've got. I've got the Rockwell Asset Center. I'm not picking on them because they're bad. I'm picking on them because they're fairly well known and a lot of people have invested in them. And we've had clients come to us and say, well, can you go to the Asset Center and then go to our WSUS instance and maybe go to our Maximo database and triangulate the data from those three and deduplicate the assets in there, and then find a way to map that back to vulnerabilities for us, or, maybe take the vulnerability scan and ingest that Excel sheet in another method. The reality is that you're now doing a lot of work to try and take data from different systems that were never necessarily built for it and make it fit the purpose of yours. And now we're in the business of custom software and coding or scripts and whatnot that we need to maintain time over time. We're in the industry to do what we do, make what we make, refining or power or widgets or what have you. And so now we're diverging into script and software development, which isn't necessarily our bailiwick. So the other challenge is that you have gaps in coverage. I mean, asset centers only give you your Rockwell stuff, and your network components only going to give maybe certain classes of your networking gear, not your rebranded OEM stuff further down the stack, et cetera. And most importantly, you're not going to the source. If people are making changes with a serial cable and an engineering laptop directly on the PLC, and you're going only the upstream database, you may or may not have the accurate information. You have to confirm that you're getting from the endpoint. So you obfuscate a lot of your information. You maybe have a lot of errors and gaps and blind spots in that approach as well. And the third, which we're seeing the largest of, and it's a little bit maddening, is it passive or packet capture technology, and more continue to evolve. And again, anyone who's heard me speak in the past 3-4 years, I have absolutely nothing against the packet capture technology being used for what it was developed, and that is anomaly detection and pattern recognition and behavior profiling. It is not, however, a source for inventory. It's the equivalent of the state trooper on the overpass with a radar gun. They can see the traffic. They can see patterns of traffic Monday morning versus Friday afternoon during different seasons, different directions, different speeds. But unless you have a state trooper on every overpass seeing every vehicle going where it's going, you will not know all of your assets. And secondly, you're only seeing that which you can observe, and then you can maybe make some inference, right? Your first pass of data is observable. Your second pass of data is inference. I see a truck and trailer heading out of town on the weekend. It must be going camping. That is a guess. I may be right. I may not. If you actually want information about the asset, you absolutely need to go to the endpoint. It is what it was built for. An endpoint inventory tool is built for inventorying the endpoint. A packet capture tool is built for looking for malicious behaviors, deviations in traffics and patterns, or potential exploits. Fantastic at that. Not ever built for inventory, and you will realize, unfortunately, the shortcoming of that if you go too far down that path. Multiple clients who spent multiple years spending lots of dollars on those tools, only to realize that they're really good, again, at the perimeter, and they kept them for that, but they went back to the drawing board, back to the market, back to the project team to go and find something more suitable for actual inventory. So back to why do we need this, and why is it important to go to the source, but also the biggest solution, which is to build a three-dimensional or contextual view, is because when you are actually going to take that inventory and do something with it, it's probably going to look like this. And this is from the ISA 99 or IEC 62443 group. They built a patch urgency decision tree as one of their recommended guidelines. And as you can see, the very first thing we need to do is know what the vulnerability patch is. And as soon as you know inventory, you're going to be asked what the vulnerability is. And then you need to be asked, does it affect ICS? If no, we're going back to work. If it is, can we find another way around it? And the only way to start to understand if we need to do something is to bring in multiple measures of the asset, its criticality to operations, its function, other compensating controls, et cetera. This is the only way to make an informed decision. So what is the solution? You build an asset-centric view. We build a view right from the asset up, OS-based, networking-based, embedded devices, as much information as possible, automatically brought back to a central aggregation point, at which point we then layer multiple indicators of risk and other components on it. To look at it in an architecture view, we have data collection on the endpoints that pulls up to 1,000 characteristics on the OS. We can pull everything that the embedded devices are pulling, just like the Rockwell Asset Center is going to talk to the Rockwell PLC. Let's go get that same data. Let's leverage that vendor manufacturing. Let's the engineering that they built into these to go and collect that data. We've already got the channels between an HMI and that PLC to go and administer that device. Let's go pull the firmware, the hardware, the serial number, the versions of software, et cetera. You bring it back to a central location. This is where you build the three-dimensional view. So the one source of data is the endpoint itself. The next source of data is that tribal knowledge I suggested a moment ago. Asset criticality, asset impact, asset location, contact information of the user, you name it. Then let's go get third-party data. At this level, we can layer vulnerabilities and exploits and other concerns around risk on this, and even patch levels. So we can start to then build the three-dimensional context offline of OT. We're not scanning OT. We're not missing large gaps of PLCs and relays when we're doing our vulnerability mapping. We're bringing and building this three-dimensional powerful model. And then the last thing we can do is go east and west and get your investment in a backup solution or antivirus or whitelisting to give you the ability to build this type of risk score. If you come through and actually look at your inventory relative to what it does, what risk is on it, how important it is to you, where it is, and what other compensating controls you have in place, you actually are able to give an informed decision as to your true risk, right? We don't build an inventory simply to know what's out there. We build an inventory to build a security program and to be able to staff it and manage it and maintain it. Now, if we do this correctly, we can automate this and bring it back to the unspoken part of this presentation is there's not an army of people out there to draw upon and to do these things like the manual input or the manual navigation between different indicators of risk. If we can bring back multiple facilities into a single view and they all have that view, then the magic is when something like Bluekeep comes out, the team, as small as it needs to be, can see immediately fleet-wide how big of an issue Bluekeep is to your organization. We can then compartmentalize devices by criticality, by function, by location. We can even start to test a patch on certain versions of Windows to share with other more critical systems of the same vintage. We can also apply compensating controls if we can't do the patch, like disabling remote desktop or the guest account. But all of it, because of that automated data collection, that we shouldn't be afraid of because it's proven for over 15 years and hundreds of thousands of assets and operational environments around the world. This gives us that visibility. We now are dealing from a position of power with a very precise, small, specialized team and scaling that coverage across the entire organization. We have seen people take their response, manual response with spreadsheets and WSUS to things like Bluekeep, and then adapt it to this automated approach for Log4j. And they have reduced that effort by 70%. So instead of spending 10 hours on it, they spend 3. They're back at their engineering job by lunch on the same day. And that increase in visibility and accuracy goes a long way to being able to allow you to understand and track your progress. Huge benefit to this approach. It leverages scarcely available resources. It gives actually contextual risk to say, yes, we need to act on this, or no, we don't. But it all comes from the amount of data you get and the context you provide. The single biggest mistake people make in OT is that they're not actually getting the three-dimensional data that they need to make informed decisions. A single indicator of risk, i.e. a vulnerability scan or a triggered alert from a passive packet capture, is a single point of reference. It doesn't have the context. If you don't build context, you won't have much value in what you're looking at. So in conclusion, inventory is by far more than a list of IP addresses. Context to assets is required to be able to turn data into contextual risk and understanding. The ability to assess true operational risk is the actual goal. Inventory in and of itself is not necessarily a destination. It is a stage in the journey. And the only way to achieve this is to go direct to the source and build a three-dimensional view of that asset. And you get bonus points if you can scale it to the enterprise. Now, these are very fast sessions. I went through a lot of stuff fairly quickly. So what I'd like to do is offer my contact information. If you did have questions or want follow-up, we'd be happy to share with you some of your peers in the industry that are doing this today, some of the lessons they've learned and some of the gains in efficiency that they have. Again, my name is Rick Kaun. I work for Verve Industrial. My contact information is up on the screen there. If you get a chance, please drop me a note. Let me know your thoughts. Otherwise, thank you and have a great rest of your session.